Hello YouTube family, and welcome to a special edition episode of If This Car Could Talk. Last Sunday we introduced you to Dan Curtis and his impressive American Motors muscle car collection. We promised we'd feature each car in more detail, with Dan providing the narration. He runs the best restoration shop in the world that specializes in these rare muscle cars, right here in Arizona. The business is called AMC Restorations, and he has an incredible inventory of NOS, nice used, refurbished, and reproduction parts anywhere for this specific niche market. Without further ado, let me introduce Dan as he shares his encyclopedic knowledge of these not often seen supercars.
Hi, my name is Dan Curtis, and I have a bunch of red, white, and blue American Motors cars that we're going to be reviewing today. And our first cars that we're going to be reviewing are the A and B scheme Rambler Scrambler. The Rambler Scrambler was an interesting exercise by American Motors after they had come out with the AMX and the Javelin. They wanted to generate some additional foot traffic in the dealership, and so they designed these new variations on the Rambler Rogue. And they took that American Motors made 390 engine and 4-speed transmission that they had in the Javelin and the AMX, and they plunked that down into this 2,950-pound Rambler American. In order to have the power accepted on that, they actually took the frame connectors that they had put on convertibles and put them into the the Rambler Rogue body. And as a result of that, they stiffened up the chassis enough so that it didn't do what the 343 Americans did in 1967, which was crack the windshields from the torque. And that's why they added the frame connectors. So now, on top of the 343, you add another 25 to 35 horsepower and another 30 or 40 pound-feet of torque, and you can understand what that would have done to that poor little Rambler Rogue body. So the first one we'll talk about is the A scheme, and that's the one with the red down the sides and the blue stripes on the top, and of course the infamous blue wheels. And that car is a car that I bought actually probably 15 years ago, and I was planning on restoring it for myself, and a customer came into my AMC restoration shop and said he was looking for an A scheme. So I offered it up to him rather than do it for myself. And so he gladly accepted that because it was a beautiful car, even at the time when he was looking at it, although it wasn't complete. And over the next year plus, we finished that car and delivered it to him in November or early December out here in the West. You can do that in the desert Southwest because that's the beautiful time of year. And he brought it home and took it to a couple of car shows, and I didn't hear much from him until about 9 months later. He called me up and asked me if I was still interested to have the car for myself. And when I asked him why, he said the car was too pristine and he couldn't stand to drive anywhere for fear that he'd get a stone chip or that he'd be in a parking lot and somebody would bang his door. He wouldn't let anybody in his garage without him being there, and his wife was getting really annoyed, so he decided it was, what he told me was it was too nice to drive. I don't harbor those sentiments. So I take the cars out and drive them, and they have a performance upgraded engine in the A scheme. It's got what is called the Group 19 performance package. And what that means is Group 19 was the actual section of the AMC manuals that listed all the performance packages. So I was fortunate enough when I built this car to actually get an original 1969 in the box Group 19 camshaft and the associated parts with that for the valve train, as well as an original Holley 953 barrel that you would get from the American Motors dealership, an R4B, which was made by intake manifold, which was made by Edelbrock, and the R4B stood for Rambler 4-barrel, and then an original set of headers, tubular exhaust headers, made by Doug Thorley at the time for American Motors, and I actually got a new old stock set of those as well. So I upgraded that with also an electronic ignition module. They actually used a Mallory dual point distributor back in those days, but I used a Mallory electronic ignition, which looks just like the original dual point. And so all that combined adds about 100 horsepower to that engine. So rather than have 315 horsepower rated, I think, at like 5,000 to 5,200 RPM, it now has 425 horsepower at about 6,000 RPM. And that car will rip your head off and grab lots of spinning tire action and noise and smoke in first and second gear, and if I hammer it hard enough, it will actually even chirp fourth gear when you're shifting at 6,000 RPM at nearly 100 miles an hour. So that's a pretty exciting car to ride in. I take it out to shows with its cousin, the B-Scheme, which we'll talk about in another minute. And those two cars, when I drive them into a show, people literally stop what they're doing in their tracks and just look at them, because a lot of the people have never actually even seen them. And the reason for that is they only made 1,512 of the A and B schemes, and only 297 of them were the B schemes, so many folks have never seen them. But you can imagine walking into the American Motors dealership in 1969 and seeing these garish and outlandishly painted cars sitting on the showroom floor. And so they were quite an amazing car. So let's talk about the twin here, the B-Scheme. So the B-Scheme is a car that has been local to Phoenix, Arizona, which is where I hail from as well, since its inception. And in fact, I am told that the Randall AMC Rambler and Jeep dealership in Mesa, Arizona, of the famed Gremlin XR, that was a 401 stuffed into a gremlin, and the R stood for Randall. I'm told that Mike Randall, the guy who came up with that option, that was his wife's car until she became too pregnant to be able to fit behind it and steer it, because it's a manual steering instead of a power steering. All Scramblers are manual steering. And so that car has been around Arizona since 1969, and it has now just 41,000 original miles on it. The interior is original. It has had one mostly repaint, but everything else in the car is pretty much the way it was in 1969, except for the engine. So I had the opportunity to pick up an engine in a car that had been professionally built, not by my shop, although we build more AMC engines than anybody else, but that particular car already had the engine built by a fellow in Tucson, and it has a cross-ram intake manifold, and what that means, it's got two 4-barrels on it and a big, huge plenum inside the intake manifold, and it's got larger tubular exhaust headers, a very stout and beefy cam. It's got roller rockers and all kinds of performance goodies in it, and that car dynoed out at 460 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. It's fully capable of going much higher than that, and I'm sure the horsepower would be higher, but the fellow who built it, that's as high as he wanted to run it and keep a warranty on it. So that car will absolutely rip your head off. In first and second gear, it will spin the big, almost 11-inch wide rear tires at will, and will rip through the quarter mile in 12 seconds or less at well over 100 miles an hour. So that's a very fast and fun car. Nonetheless, I try to keep the rest of it, the inside and the outside, as original as I can, because with only 297 of those made and probably way less than 200 or even less than 150 remaining, it's a pretty rare bird. And so, although I like to use the engines in them for the purpose they were designed and the way we've built them, I do have to behave, because that would be a very hard car to replace if something crazy happened. On the Scramblers, the other thing that they added on the Scrambler, which was a stock component on the AMX only, was what was called torque links. And torque links are adjustable shafts that are mounted to the frame as well as mounted to the top of the rear axle, and that stops the rear end from bouncing when the tires start to spin. And that's a pretty unique feature. So with both the 68 to 70 AMXs as well as the Rambler Scrambler, if you dump the clutch, it just goes. And I had a signature that my brother once recognized when I did a burnout on a side street near our home when we were growing up. And because of those torque links, my burnouts would have an S-bend to them. And my brother came home one night and said, "Hey, I see you did a burnout on Jacobs Lane, huh?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I saw your signature on the street." So that's what those things will do for you, though. You can dump the clutch and lay down 30 or 40 feet of black stripes without any fanfare and no bouncing up on the rear axles. And that's one of the reasons why those cars were so successful at the dragway, because you didn't have to do major modifications like ladder bars or other contraptions to do that. The other thing they did on the Scrambler was they offset mounted the two rear shocks. One's in front of the axle and one's behind the axle. And as a result of that, that also helps to tame that twist and bounce action. So the Scramblers came stock with a 3.54 rear end, and that they all had a positive posi unit in it, and they were the twin. It had a much heavier spider gear and heavier clutch pack in it, and so the 66, I think it was, to 71 or 70 posi units, which were much stronger. The weak point in the AMC drivetrain, however, was they have spline shaft rear axles, and what people don't realize, we have discovered this as a result of being a restoration shop, is you have to maintain those spline shafts. You have to retorque the nuts on the hub on the axles because it's a two-piece axle. You've got a hub with the splines and the axle cut into it, and a keyway to keep the hub and axle relationship aligned if you ever take it off. But if you don't maintain that and retorque it, you'll end up spinning the axle inside the hub. Made by Dana, it's called a Corporate Model 20, and it is a very stout axle. It's a big, heavy rear end unit. It's got a very strong posi unit in it prior to 71. And so it's very durable. As I say, I beat the crap out of one for 50 years, and I never even had any problems with it.
Thanks, Dan, for sharing your two beautiful cars with our YouTube family today. What did you guys think? Please leave a comment and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that you never miss any of our weekly videos. Next Sunday, we'll continue to feature another great car from the Curtis collection. This time it's a limited edition Trans Am 1970 Javelin in red, white, and blue. It's a fresh restoration, and it's a stunner. With only 100 ever made, it's likely you've never even seen one. Don't miss this one. See you next Sunday, and remember, please be careful out there.